Bonhoeffer's insights do not merely indict individuals. They offer a broader critique of the social conditions that cultivate and sustain stupidity. He believed that stupidity is not an inherent trait of individuals, but rather a societal phenomenon that arises under specific conditions, especially when individuals are isolated from meaningful dialogue or stripped of responsibility. In other words, people become stupid not because they are inherently incapable of thought, but because systems of power and conformity discourage thinking. This is particularly evident in mass movements, where individuality is replaced by group identity, and critical reasoning gives way to collective slogans and ideologies. In such environments, people may abandon their capacity for judgment in favor of convenience, safety, or acceptance. Bonhoeffer emphasizes that stupidity flourishes where individuals surrender their autonomy, allowing external forces to dictate their beliefs and actions. This surrender is not always coerced. It is often willingly offered, a trade of intellectual freedom for a sense of belonging or perceived security. The more one merges with the crowd, the easier it becomes to disengage from ethical responsibility. Perhaps most chillingly, Bonhoeffer warns that rational argument and evidence are useless against stupidity. Attempts to persuade a stupid person with facts or logic do not penetrate their worldview because their commitment is not to truth but to identity, ideology, or authority. In this way, stupidity becomes a closed loop, immune to dialogue, impervious to reason, and dangerous precisely because it mimics the appearance of normalcy while harboring a deep resistance to change. Unlike malice, which reveals itself in harmful intent, stupidity often wears a benign face. It may even appear friendly, humble, or well-meaning. Yet this deceptive innocence is part of what makes it so perilous. A malicious person can be identified, confronted, and contained. A stupid person, on the other hand, may unknowingly aid destructive forces, convinced they are doing the right thing, all while closing their mind to any suggestion otherwise. Bonhoeffer's reflections are not a condemnation of human fallibility, but a call to vigilance. They challenge us to remain intellectually awake, to resist the seductions of passive conformity, and to take personal responsibility for our beliefs and actions. He believed that the only antidote to stupidity is inner liberation, the process by which individuals reclaim their autonomy through reflection, courage, and moral integrity. In a time when simplistic answers and ideological echo chambers dominate discourse, Bonhoeffer's warning is more relevant than ever. Stupidity, in his view, is not just a personal failing, it is a social and political danger that threatens the very fabric of a free and ethical society. His message is clear. The true battle for humanity is not merely against evil, but against the widespread refusal to think. Together, Bonhoeffer's diagnosis of stupidity and Arendt's concept of the banality of evil form a sobering lens through which to examine the modern human condition. Both thinkers draw attention to the devastating power of thoughtlessness, not merely as a personal flaw, but as a structural vulnerability that can be weaponized by authoritarian systems. Their insights reveal how systems of oppression do not require legions of sadistic perpetrators. Instead, they thrive on the silent cooperation of ordinary individuals who, by refusing to think critically, become enablers of monstrous deeds. This refusal to think is not always conscious. It often arises from fear, fatigue, or the seductive comfort of conformity. To stand apart, to question, to resist, these acts demand courage and intellectual effort. In contrast, to go along, to obey, to suppress doubt, these require only passivity. And yet, it is precisely this passivity that both Bonhoeffer and Arendt identify as the true breeding ground of evil. Modern society, with its bureaucratic machinery, digital echo chambers, and relentless pace, may be more prone than ever to this form of intellectual slumber. The ability to outsource responsibility to algorithms, to institutions, to collective ideologies has never been easier. With every surrender of personal agency, the capacity for moral judgment is dulled. The result is a populace that may function efficiently on the surface, but lacks the ethical and intellectual resilience to resist injustice when it arises. Arendt warns that the great crimes of history are not always perpetrated by monsters in the shadows, but by clerks, soldiers, neighbors, and citizens who simply do not ask questions. Their evil lies not in hatred, but in their mechanical obedience to systems that demand no thought, only action. This kind of evil is insidious precisely because it does not feel evil to the one enacting it. It feels normal. It feels like following the rules. In this way, stupidity becomes institutionalized, not just tolerated, but encouraged. Schools, workplaces, governments, and media can all reinforce habits of obedience, discourage dissent, and prize efficiency over wisdom. In such environments, the loudest voices are often those that shout, not those that think. And as nuance disappears, so too does the space for moral reckoning. The challenge then is not only to recognize stupidity in others, but to guard against it in ourselves. Bonhoeffer and Arendt compel us to remain vigilant, not just politically, but intellectually and ethically. They urge us to see thinking not as a luxury, but as a moral imperative. To think critically is not simply an academic exercise. It is an act of resistance. It is a stand against conformity, manipulation, and the silent spread of evil. In an age saturated with information but starving for wisdom, their warnings are more urgent than ever. True resistance begins not in the streets, but in the mind. It begins with the courage to ask, to doubt, to reflect. For if we lose our capacity to think deeply and independently, we risk becoming the very instruments of destruction we once swore to resist. Forces that favor emotional resonance over intellectual rigor. When ideas are repeated often enough, no matter how illogical, they can take on the appearance of truth. This phenomenon, known as the illusory truth effect, is a cornerstone of propaganda, marketing, and ideological manipulation. It reveals how deeply our perceptions of truth are shaped not by evidence or reason, but by familiarity and social validation. This is how stupidity becomes systemic. When societies prioritize comfort, conformity, and emotional gratification over truth, they create fertile ground for irrationality to thrive. Institutions that were once intended to promote knowledge, schools, media, public discourse, can become mechanisms for spreading simplified narratives that discourage complexity and nuance. In such an environment, the difficult task of critical thinking becomes not only rare, but suspect. Those who question dominant ideas or refuse to accept easy answers are often labeled as contrarians, elitists, or even threats. The danger of this social contagion of stupidity lies in its capacity to disarm entire populations. People no longer need to be coerced into obedience. They willingly adopt it, seduced by the ease of certainty. In this climate, ignorance becomes a kind of armor, protecting individuals from the cognitive dissonance that comes with acknowledging uncomfortable truths. But this armor also becomes a prison. It restricts growth, dulls empathy, and blinds people to the moral dimensions of their actions. To resist this contagion, we must foster intellectual immunity. Just as physical immunity is strengthened through exposure and healthy habits, so too can mental resilience be cultivated through education, dialogue, and a culture that values questioning over obedience. The goal is not to create a society where everyone agrees, but one where disagreement is thoughtful, respectful, and grounded in reason. A society where ideas are tested, not just accepted, where beliefs are examined, not just inherited. This requires courage, both personal and collective. The courage to stand apart from the crowd, the courage to admit when we're wrong, the courage to live in the discomfort of not having all the answers. It also requires humility, an acknowledgement that intelligence is not the same as infallibility, and that even the most rational among us are susceptible to error and bias. The thinkers we've explored, Bonhoeffer, Arendt, Russell, did not merely critique the world as it was. They offered a vision of what it could be, a world where individuals resist intellectual laziness not out of superiority, but out of responsibility. A world where the act of thinking is not dismissed as elitist or impractical, but recognized as the first line of defense against tyranny, injustice, and collective delusion. In this light, the battle against stupidity is not a war of intellects, but a moral struggle. It is a fight to preserve the dignity of thought in a world increasingly hostile to reflection. It is a call to reclaim our agency, not only as thinkers, but as citizens, neighbors, and human beings. If we are to build a society rooted in justice, empathy, and truth, we must begin by confronting the systems that perpetuate ignorance. And we must do so not with contempt, but with conviction, not by mocking the foolish, but by awakening the dormant potential for wisdom in all of us. For in the end, the greatest resistance to the banality of stupidity is the bravery to think. Their claims. This deference can be dangerous when it fosters passive acceptance instead of active engagement. When authority is equated with truth, the very foundation of democratic dialogue is undermined. People begin to outsource their thinking, allowing decisions to be made for them rather than by them. In such a culture, obedience becomes the default, and critical thinking becomes a threat. This tendency is not just the product of authoritarian structures, it is reinforced by the routines of daily life. Bureaucracies, standardized education systems, corporate hierarchies, and even religious institutions often prioritize efficiency, obedience, and predictability over originality and inquiry. The result is a kind of systemic inertia where people are rewarded for compliance and penalized for dissent. Over time, individuals may stop questioning not because they are unintelligent, but because they have been trained not to. The implications are profound. When people fail to think critically, not only do they become more susceptible to manipulation, they also become complicit in the perpetuation of harmful systems. Hannah Arendt's observation about the banality of evil resonates here. It is not monstrous intent, but unthinking participation that enables atrocities to occur. Likewise, Dietrich Bonhoeffer's warning about the moral dangers of stupidity highlights how intellectual passivity can make ordinary people instruments of injustice. To resist the social contagion of stupidity, we must radically reimagine the environments in which beliefs are formed. Education must prioritize questioning over memorization. Media must privilege depth over virality. Leadership must encourage dialogue over dogma. And most importantly, society must value the courage it takes to dissent, not as rebellion for its own sake, but as a vital act of intellectual integrity. True resistance begins on an individual level. It requires each of us to interrogate our assumptions, challenge our biases, and stay alert to the forces that seek to lull us into complacency. This is not easy. Thinking critically is emotionally and cognitively taxing. It often means standing alone, being misunderstood, or feeling uncertain. But it is the price of moral agency and civic responsibility. In today's hyper-connected world, where misinformation spreads faster than ever and ideological echo chambers are the norm, the antidote to stupidity must be a conscious, collective effort to cultivate intellectual humility, curiosity, and courage. We must learn to live with complexity, to engage in uncomfortable conversations, and to embrace the messy, iterative nature of truth. The philosophers we've examined, Bonhoeffer, Arendt, Russell, each offer a piece of the puzzle. They show us that stupidity is not just ignorance, but a choice to stop thinking. It is a psychological defense mechanism, a social convenience, and a political tool. But it is also a contingent phenomenon, meaning it can be challenged, disrupted, and ultimately changed. The question then is not whether stupidity will always exist. It will. The question is whether we will have the courage to think in spite of it. Would you like to close the video with a narrative call to action, or explore this further with another example? Maybe Orwell's 1984, or even something from modern psychology like cognitive dissonance or social identity theory.